And now it's Simon's turn to present to us. So Simon, what is a shockwave?
Okay, thank you, James. Well, it's a pleasure to be involved in this educational series supported by Shockwave. My name is Simon Wilson. I'm a consultant cardiologist at St George's Hospital in London. And what I'm going to talk about, or try and explain in the next 10 to 15 minutes, is what really is a shockwave, what are the properties of a shockwave, and what we've learned about shockwaves from renal lithotripsy in terms of the mechanism by which they can affect stone or calcium fragmentation, and also the mechanisms by which they can potentially cause tissue harm. And I think if we understand these different things, then it really helps to explain why intravascular lithotripsy is such an exciting technology, and we can really begin to appreciate what adaptations have been made to the technology for the intravascular environment to maximize its efficiency or efficacy and minimize the risk of complication. And that's something that Ziad's going to talk in a subsequent presentation. So if we think about what is a shockwave, I think it's helpful to have a reference with which we're more familiar with, and that's the humble sound wave. So a sound wave is just an example of an acoustic wave, which in turn is just a type of energy propagation or method of energy propagation through a medium by means of compression and decompression. So if we look at the classic tuning fork, as it vibrates, it creates oscillating periods of high and low pressure as the adjacent particles are first pushed together and then spread apart. So sound, therefore, is just really a repeating pattern of high and low pressure. And a shockwave is also a type of acoustic wave, but it has very different properties compared to an ordinary sound wave. And this is really visible when you compare the pressure time profiles of a sound wave on the left and a shockwave on the right. So if we look at a shockwave in more detail, the key characteristics are that there's a very high amplitude positive pressure phase or compression phase. And it's marked by an extremely rapid rise in pressure and a narrow pulse width. And this essentially creates a period of abrupt and almost discontinuous change in pressure, density, and temperature. And this is followed by a comparatively lower amplitude negative pressure phase or tensile phase. Now the tensile phase, if you can contrast that to the compression phase, it creates pulling or stretching forces. And as we'll learn later, these are important mechanisms for stone comminution and also tissue injury. Okay, so how are shock waves created? Well, the commonest way or commonest method is when the source of the sound or acoustic wave is traveling through a medium at or above the speed of sound for that medium. We'll be familiar with explosions or when our fighter jet moving through the air. So as the speed of the object creating the sound increases, then successive compression waves traveling in the same direction as the object find it harder and harder to escape. And as we get to the speed of sound or exceed the speed of sound, these compression waves cannot escape from one another and they rapidly pile up, leading to a very high region of pressure through constructive interference. And at these very high amplitudes, then the normal laws of propagation are exceeded, meaning that the high pressure regions travel at greater velocity than the low pressure regions, and this leads to progressive steepening of the pressure rise and the formation of the characteristic abrupt pressure time profile of a shock wave that we've seen earlier. Okay, so in terms of mechanisms of effect, we've known that, or we've used shock waves in renal lithotripsy since the early 80s. And this really came about following the discovery that shock waves can pass through living tissue without causing significant injury while being strong enough to disrupt hard stones. And this is really predicated on two key things. First, the elasticity of soft tissue allows even very high amplitude pressure waves of short duration to pass through without causing harm. And second, is that when a shock wave encounters a tissue interface, then disruptive forces are produced if there's a big acoustic mismatch. Or in other words, if there's a big difference in density between one medium and the next medium. So if you take water and soft tissues, they have very similar acoustic impedances, which allow shock waves to propagate through without causing harm. But when the shock wave encounters or travels from a soft tissue to hard tissue or vice versa, then there's a big acoustic mismatch, and so strong forces are generated. In terms of the specific mechanisms of effect, well, what happens when a shock wave encounters a tissue interface? Well, in broad terms, part of that wave will be transmitted and part of that wave will be reflected. And this will generate varying degrees of compression and tensile forces in both mediums that will depend on the direction and magnitude of the acoustic difference. So to specifics, we know from renal lithotripsy that fragmentation of stones or calcific tissue occurs due to a combination of compressive, tensile, and other stresses. We've got a nice animation here. We can see an approaching shock wave, and as it strikes the anterior surface of a stone, part of that wave will be transmitted, and this creates compressive forces at the front end of the stone. Next, as the wave continues to transmit through the stone, shear forces are produced. And then as it approaches the rear end of the stone, again, this is another tissue interface, so part of the wave will be transmitted and part of the wave is reflected. Now, because the wave is moving from an area of high density to an area of much lower density, the wave is not only reflected, but it's inverted, and this is known as the Hopkinson effect. And because it's inverted, there's then a sudden creation of a large amount of tensile stress. And this has the effect of pulling the back end of the stone, creating a lot of disruption, and this process is known as spallation. Another force that's known to be cause stone disruption is squeezing. And really, in essence, this is because of the shock wave that's traveling through the stone will be moving at a higher velocity compared to the same shock wave that's traveling around the outside of the stone. And this creates a squeezing force. And finally, there's cavitation. Now, cavitation is an important mechanism of stone erosion and also implicated in tissue injury. And essentially what cavitation is, when the trailing negative pressure wave or negative pressure part of this shock wave, as it moves through any fluid medium, it can induce cavity bubbles to form. And if those cavity bubbles are located in close proximity to a tissue surface, then they can collapse in an asymmetric fashion, leading to a microjet of high velocity directed towards the stone surface, causing erosion and damage. Okay, so there's beneficial effects that shock waves have in terms of disrupting stones or fragments, and also, but also shock waves can have harmful tissue effects. And these are mainly caused by cavitation or where there's a major mismatch in acoustic impedances. So, as we just talked about, shock waves can induce cavity formation in any fluid-filled compartment, which includes blood vessels. And microjetting can occur, causing the potential for damage to the blood vessel or any other organ that contains fluid. Now, very large acoustic mismatches typically or exclusively really occur when there's a tissue-gas interface. And when this occurs, over 99.9% of the wave is reflected, and it will be inverted as well. So there's a generation of a large amount of tensile stress, and this causes a lot of tissue injury, disruption, and even perforation. If you compare that, for example, to when a shock wave goes from one soft tissue to the next soft tissue, only 1% of the wave will typically be reflected, and when it passes from a tissue to a stone, about 25% of the wave is reflected. Okay, so in summary, what we've learned is that shock waves are a form of acoustic wave characterized by a very high pressure positive wave of short duration. We know that shock waves can travel through soft tissues and across tissue interfaces of similar acoustic impedance without causing injury, but when they encounter a significant acoustic mismatch, then disruptive forces are produced, which we can utilize to cause local fragmentation of tissues to our benefit. So that's the end of the talk, and I'll go back to the studio. Thank you.
Great. Simon, that was a great talk. I mean, it sort of brought me back to school in some ways. A bit of physics going on there, and the animations were lovely. But I guess the question that we're all asking ourselves is, why should we care?
Well, I think for me anyway, if you understand the mechanism of any technology, then it really helps you to engage with that technology, and more importantly, understand why that technology can be so effective. It's such a simple idea, isn't it? Taking some technology that we've known about for 4 decades, that's effective for breaking up kidney stones, and now we're applying it to the intravascular compartment. So everything sort of makes sense. And I think if we just drill down into the actual mechanisms of effect a little bit more, then it helps to understand the principles of it. And also, it's going to help us understand where it's going to be most effective and I know that Ziad's going to come on to this as well, what Shockwave have done to modify the technology specific to the vascular compartment to make sure to maximize its efficacy and minimize the risk of complications.
Yeah, and I like what you've done there, drilled down into the mechanisms. There's a bit of a play on words there.
That was unintentional.
That's great work.
Yeah.
So based on what you presented there, you said, well, understanding the mechanisms helps us understand where we're going to get the most effect out of the technology. So where are we going to get the most effect out of the technology?
Well, I think understanding the mechanisms tells us, it's, for me, what I took away from this is that it's clear that this type of technology can be safe, because the disruptive forces are just generated at regions of high acoustic impedance. So it's going to allow you to deliver the shockwave through the tissues and then just specifically focus in on target on calcium. So and that's selective. Selective, and that's unique to amongst the different modalities for calcium modification that we have. Certainly amongst the balloon-based technologies. Yes. So it's selective. Doesn't really. It means it's going to be useful in all types of calcium, whether it's superficial or deep. Yeah. But I suppose we'd still need more studies to understand specifically whether it's going to be most helpful in concentric calcium, which we believe it is, or how we can use it, or perhaps how we can adapt it in the future to deal with, eccentric calcium or nodular calcium. That's something that we'll need more work on.
And as you say, the dose relationship is still quite unclear as well. So just getting back to that mechanism of action again, and the selectivity of coronary calcium, how would you summarize how it affects the disruptive effect on the calcium itself?
Well, I think I know that I don't want to go too much into what Ziad might be covering, but what we know from renal lithotripsy is that there's certain mechanisms by which it's effective. There's compression. There's this shear forces that are created. There's this spallation, with the back end of the stone where the wave is inverted, creating a lot of tensile stress. And there's squeezing, and there's also this cavitation. And all those are important in terms of disrupting stones. But some of these properties are harmful, and that's particularly the cavitation and also these tensile stresses. And I think a key difference between intravascular lithotripsy and stone comminution is that we're trying to achieve, the objective is slightly different. In stone comminution, we're going to pulverize the stone so it can pass. But in intravascular lithotripsy, what we're trying to do is just fragment the calcium. We're not trying to disrupt it. So that has allowed the technology, particularly the wave itself, to be modified such that it delivers just compressive force to disrupt the stone, but it avoids the complications of having high negative tensile stresses, avoids cavitation, induction, etc.
So, that's an excellent answer, Simon. And I've got another question for you, because there's something very inbuilt in human to compare things. We want to compare X with Y. We have a real relative judgment thing that happens all the time, So if you, and I've seen some numbers bandied around, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if we think about the effects of barotrauma in the vessel, so we inflate a balloon, and we can inflate that balloon from anything from 10 to even 50 atmospheres with an OPM balloon. And one of the reasons why we use some of these very high pressure barotraumas, we don't use them unless we really have to, is because we're concerned at the effects on inflammation, medial trauma, and the subsequent kind of restenotic process that can be instigated by, severely disrupting vessels like that. Now, I've heard that the atmospheric pressure equivalent from a shockwave is in the region of 60 atmospheres. How would you compare what it could potentially do to the medial disruption to a balloon inflated to that level?
Well, the pressure, if you just compare and say the pressures are 60 atmospheres, that could take you by surprise and think that's a lot of force. And I'm definitely a believer that we need to apply enough disruption to the lesion, whether it's calcified, to restore vascular compliance, because that's critical. But we don't want to just blindly apply massive amounts of force when we don't need to. So it's got to be the appropriate amount of force to achieve adequate vessel compliance. Because I do think that if you create a lot of tissue disruption, a lot of tears, there are studies showing that that is going to promote restenosis, as you said. But the difference is that shockwave is targeted.
Yeah.
So you're right in saying it is 60 atmospheres, but as I hopefully conveyed in my talk, that the disruptive forces are only created when the shockwave goes through a tissue interface where there's a big acoustic mismatch. So that force is applied only around the calcium fragment. It's not going to be applied to the soft tissues. And so it's, as we said before, it's selected, it's targeted, and that's the goal of anything, isn't it?
Of course.
Targeted therapy. And that's what this really is. It's targeted to calcium.
So it's not just a question of teaching the arterial lesson, Simon.
It's teaching the calcium now. We can modify our talk. Teaching the calcium a lesson.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Simon.